just to get started, uh, one area of the chart talk is about the what's driving the projected deficits over the cumulative 30 years. You've got about $112 trillion of projected deficits over the next 30 years, and we don't always look back. We're always talking about what's happening on Washington on the Hill, but what is that? What's driving that? What's the story behind that?
Well, thanks, Bob. It's a good question because you throw out numbers like $112 trillion in projected deficits over 30 years. That's such a huge number. It's almost incomprehensible. Right now, the debt held by the public is about 23 trillion. So the idea of adding 112 trillion is really incomprehensible. And people can ask, well, where's all that borrowing come from? And really, the issue is it's not coming from necessarily from taxes. Tax revenues are going to continue rising as a percent of the economy. It's not going to come from discretionary spending. That's falling as a percent of the economy. And in fact, most entitlement programs are kind of holding steady as the percent of the economy. So where is all this debt coming from? Really, mostly two programs, Social Security and Medicare. Excuse me. The issue with Social Security and Medicare is people pay into the system, but the premiums and payroll taxes aren't enough to pay the benefits for all the retirees. So as 74 million boomers retire into Social Security and Medicare, they have to supplement it with general revenues. Washington is going to have to transfer general revenues into Social Security and Medicare to pay the benefits that just your payroll taxes and Medicare premiums can't cover. And it's the cost of those transfers into Social Security and Medicare that are driving virtually the entire $112 trillion shortfall. For example, Social Security is going to run about a $21 trillion cash shortfall, which is then going to, because we're going to have to borrow a lot of that money, it's going to in turn add 14 trillion in interest. So that's $35 trillion in outside revenues that we're going to need because of Social Security. Medicare is even worse. It's going to require $46 trillion in general revenues, and that's going to create an interest cost of 31 trillion. So that's 78 trillion from Medicare that's going to be required in general revenues. Another way of looking at it is if you just look at like a percentage of the economy, Social Security and Medicare in 30 years are going to be collecting 6% of GDP in payroll taxes and revenues, but spending 21% of GDP in terms of benefits and resulting interest costs. Well, when you have two programs running a deficit of 15% of GDP, there's your long-term deficit. The rest of the budget at that point will be in surplus. But when you have two programs running a 15% of GDP shortfall, there's your long-term deficit.
So just two quick clarifying points here, Brian. Number one, you talk about these numbers like $121 trillion in deficits over the next 30 years and how people's minds just go, that's just so unbelievable. I think it's important to point out that these are not your numbers, right? They come from the Congressional Budget Office, which is the scoring agency for Congress, correct? I mean, you might do the arithmetic, but these are not your forecasts, right?
Correct. This is just straight out of the Congressional Budget Office, which is a nonpartisan agency within Congress, very credible on both sides, ran these numbers themselves. And I just divided it up into where it's going. And in fact, this is the CBO's rosy scenario. This assumes no new spending expansions, no new tax cuts, no new wars, no major recessions. This is just the cost of doing what we're doing on current law.
Second question is, I know we run into a lot of people that really don't understand the problem with drawing down the assets, the bonds held by the Social Security and Medicare trust funds. How come that doesn't help the situation at all?
The Social Security Trust Fund has about $3 trillion right now. What that means is that from 1983 to 2009, Social Security ran a surplus of about $3 to $3.5 trillion. But they didn't really save that money, they spent it, which means that now the taxpayers have to repay that $3 to $3.5 trillion to Social Security. First off, $3 trillion is not that much in the context of $112 trillion in borrowing. Even if we had saved that money, it really wouldn't have made a huge difference. But even then, because it was already spent, there isn't a mountain of $3 trillion that's available to pay out these benefits. It represents money that has to be repaid out of tax dollars. Now, the trust fund matters from a legal sense in that people are owed these benefits. But in terms of actual having the money to pay it out, there really isn't $3 trillion. It's IOUs that will be paid in general revenues, just like the other $109 trillion.
Right. So we think those of us that work with the federal budget, we think about the trust fund as an accounting construct, right? It represents money that we owe, but those bonds that are held by the Social Security and Medicare trust funds are not sort of economic assets that you can then just, redeem for cash the way you could a different type of bond, right? It just means that Treasury is going to take that bond from the Social Security Trust Fund and say, I'm going to have to go borrow debt from the public markets in order to pay money to Social Security. So you're basically exchanging internal debt, right, with external debt.
Exactly. And one way to think of it is, people will point out that $3 trillion is an asset for Social Security. Well, it's a liability for the taxpayers who are paying it back. So it's good for the program, but it's still got to be paid.